Welcome back, everyone. This is David Patrick Harry with Church of the Eternal Logos, and today I want to speak to you guys about synchronicity and divine providence, or God's providence, or God's will, depending on how you understand that concept. However, before I dive into it, I first want to note that this is, of course, the last video of 2019, and just mention that 2019 has been a very transitionary year. I know for myself, but from the handful of emails I received, from the comments I've seen on videos, it's been a transitionary year for you guys, for some of you at least, and the decade as a whole. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to make this video today and have it be the last video of this decade. Because when I look back at 2010 and I look back at myself and my own journey, my own progression towards Christianity, moving through the New Age, through the psychedelic culture, through all the different world religions, and how I wound up here doing what I'm doing, I just see a lot of synchronicities, a lot of providential occurrences on the way. And so I'm sure this would be true for you guys as well. Of course, hindsight's always 20/20, right? But looking back since 2010 to today, last day of 2019, so much to be thankful for, so much change, so much maturation. I'm sure that'd be true for you guys as well. And even though I view so much of my activities or beliefs of the previous decade as being incorrect, it was such a learning experience, and I gained so many skills and abilities, such as all the things I've read, all the things I've learned to even articulate the ideas to you guys now, despite maybe not being so in favor of and much more critical of now than I was before. So with that being said, this is why then I created this video, worked on this video, Synchronicity in God's Providence, because synchronicity is obviously a very, very common term used amongst the New Age, amongst the spiritual but not religious, amongst the, whatever you want to name it, in terms of these kind of divine occurrences, these meaningful occurrences. So I wanted to, in this video, give a small little sample of Carl Jung, his understanding of synchronicity, touch on theories that are trying to debunk this idea, such as probability theory, psychology, quantum physics, and then hit on New Age understandings of synchronicity, and then contrast everything that was said with Christian understandings, particularly Orthodox Christian understandings of God's providence or divine providence and the kind of providential hand working throughout history, working in individual lives, and how this is a very easily associated concept with synchronicity. In fact, synchronicity, once we get into it, we'll see how it really falls into place within a Christian worldview of providential occurrences. So with all that being said, now let's get into it. And so the first thing that I want to talk to you guys is synchronicity, and what exactly is it? Well, it was developed by Carl Jung. I'm sure most of you guys already know who Carl Jung is. I should pop up a little info window here. Lived from 1875 to 1961. He was a very famous Swiss psychologist. Arguably, him and Freud basically took the cake from the late 19th century and early 20th century in terms of psychology. And Jung was incredibly successful in terms of giving us new psychological tools to understand the self, the psyche, all this stuff, including synchronicity, as well as archetypes, psychological archetypes, patternistic archetypes, mythological archetypes, the collective unconscious. This was a big one, again, associated with Carl Jung. Psychological complexes, again, rooted in the work of Carl Jung. The development of the idea of extroversion and introversion in regards to, again, personality types is related to Carl Jung. The anima animus, and then the shadow self, this is all in the work of Carl Jung. Now, I like some of the stuff of Carl Jung. I think that it falls short if you're of a Christian persuasion. Certainly, it falls short. It tries to psychologize everything into sort of the unconscious versus the conscious. He's not as big into sexual repression as we find in Freud. But Jung is very useful nonetheless, and I think everybody should familiarize themselves with his work, whether you agree with it or disagree. In fact, one of the things that I will be reading from today is a book, famous book, called Man and His Symbols, and it's edited with an introduction by Carl Jung, but it's basically about the work of Carl Jung, and in it, there's just a brief section that I want to highlight regarding discussion on synchronicity. So synchronicity, one of the ideas that Jung developed, it was actually first introduced in around the 1920s, but it wasn't fully explicated and developed in terms of a real theory of Jung until basically the 1950s in his Uranus lectures. The way that he described it is, I guess he'd call it meaningful coincidence. So what he was trying to do with the concept of synchronicity is reframe causality. And we have a typical cause and effect, a causal relationship on our understanding of the occurrences of events in the world. Jung was saying that there's another form of causation, and it has to do with meaning. And so he called synchronicity an acausal parallelism. He called it a temporarily coincident occurrences of acausal events. And like I said, the most important notion related to Jung's theory of synchronicity is meaning. And that meaning is actually connecting events over time, not causality. It's not a domino effect of causation, but rather meaning is the casuistry of meaning is actually being pinpointed at a particular event based on the psyche and the understanding of the individual to recognize the symbol or the synchronistic event that is occurring and how that meaning is unfolding. So that's really what is the root of synchronicity. It has to do with events occurring in the world based on meaning. And so before I get into some of the ways that people are very critical of this idea, I first want to read what it says in Man and His Symbols regarding synchronicity. And the author writes, the fact that this highest and most frequent symbol, this was referring to the sort of philosopher's stone. So when it refers to the stone, it's referring to the philosopher's stone, this sort of magical concept that you can get the philosopher's stone and does these magical things. You can do anything you want with it, but it's also this sort of mental projection. You can do anything with it. That was from the magical alchemical perspective. For Jung, it's a very psychological symbol because you guys may already be familiar with John Dee and Edward Kelly. They had what they considered to be the philosopher's stone, where they would stare into it and sort of project their own psyche into it and then read that back in the form of contacting angels or something like this. This is what Jung is getting at, and the stone as a sort of psychological projection of the self. But when they refer to the stone, that's what it's meaning. So it says, the fact that this highest and most frequent symbol of the self is an object of inorganic matter points to yet another field of inquiry and speculation. That is, the still unknown relationship between what we call the unconscious psyche and what we call matter, a mystery which psychosomatic medicine endeavors to grapple. The placebo effect. In studying this still undefined and unexplained connection, it may prove to be that psyche and matter are actually the same phenomenon, one observed from within and the other from without. Dr. Jung put forward a new concept that he called synchronicity. This term means a meaningful coincidence of outer and inner events that are not themselves causally connected. This emphasis lies on the word meaningful, as I was trying to hint at. If an aircraft crashes before my eyes as I am blowing my nose, this is a coincidence of events that has no meaning. It is simply a chance occurrence of a kind that happens all the time. But if I bought a blue frock and by mistake the shop delivered a black one on the day that my near relatives died, this would be a meaningful coincidence. The two events are not causally related, but they are connected by the symbolic meaning that our society gives to the color black. Wherever Dr. Jung observed such meaningful coincidences in an individual's life, it seemed, as the individual's dream revealed, that there was an archetype activated in the unconscious of the individual concerned. To illustrate this, by my example of the blue frock, in such a case, the person who received the black frock might also have had a dream of the theme of death. It seems as if the underlying archetype is manifesting itself simultaneously in inner and external events. The common denominator is a symbolically expressed message, in this case, a message about death. As soon as we notice these certain types of event like to cluster together at certain times, we begin to understand the attitude of the Chinese, whose theories of medicine, philosophy, and even building are based on a science of meaningful coincidences. The classical Chinese text did not ask what causes what, but rather what likes to occur with what. One can see the same underlying theme in astrology and in the way various civilizations have depended on consulting oracles and paying attention to omens. All of these are attempts to provide an explanation of coincidence that is different from one that depends on straightforward cause and effect. In creating the concept of synchronicity, Dr. Jung sketched a way in which we might penetrate deeper into the inner relation of psyche and matter, and it is precisely towards such a relation that the symbol of the stone seems to point. But this is still a completely open and insufficiently explored matter which future generations of psychologists and physicists must deal. And then there's another paragraph that I will skip. So this is a brief introduction to what Jung understood synchronicity to be. In fact, I have one more quote here that I want to use of Jung himself, where he describes synchronicity, or how he came up with the term synchronicity. He says, "It is impossible with our present resources to explain ESP, extrasensory perception, sixth senses, stuff like this, or the fact of meaningful coincidence as a phenomenon of energy. This makes an end of the causal explanation as well for effect cannot be understood as anything except a phenomenon of energy. Therefore, it cannot be a question of cause and effect, but a falling together in time, a kind of simultaneity. Because of this quality of simultaneity, I have picked on the term synchronicity to designate a hypothetical factor equal in rank to causality as a principle of explanation." So for him, synchronicity and meaningful causation is equal in its ability for explanatory power as cause and effect, as causality. So, okay, now this is we got the idea of synchronicity. What's going on here? Well, clearly this isn't going to be picked up by a lot of people, and spiritualists, people within the spiritual world, they love the idea of synchronicity. And we'll get into kind of religious interpretations, but of course you have these skeptics, and the first way to sort of disprove or attempt to disprove the idea of synchronicity is probability theory, or the law of truly large numbers, in which they claim what you're doing is just, out of infinite possibility, essentially, this event has occurred, and now you're reading meaning into it. Statistically speaking, this is nonsense. This is what the probabilitist or the statistician might say. However, interestingly, statistics work by definition by avoiding novel or unique instances for understandings of larger general trends. So statistics as a discipline actually undermines the idea of even disproving synchronicities, because by definition, synchronicity is a synchronistic, unique, novel, one-time event, and therefore statistics wouldn't even pick it up anyways. That's not what they're interested in. So that would be the criticism from statistics, and then the rebuttal to it. Then you have psychology. In psychology, basically, one of them highlights that this idea of discovering meaning in multiple places is the kind of the beginning stage of delusion. And synchronicity then is a form of confirmation or selection bias. And the confirmation bias is really you, again, reading meaning into the world, meaning that's not there, that's not self-evident. And it's a lack, this is what some psychologists would say, or some people that are more skeptically minded would say that the apprehension of synchronistic events is a sort of a lack of true critical thinking. This is how they would frame it. There's also apophenia, which is a psychological diagnosis in which the mistaken detection of patterns or meaning. So people can be diagnosed with apophenia, and where they're witnessing patterns and meaning in all these ironic places. You've seen, the comic series or movies about the kind of the mad person that's always cutting things out of newspapers or finding new meanings and patterns. This would be apophenia. Seeing meaning, faces in clouds, wood, man in the moon. This is a form of pattern recognition, like faces, for example. This is what the psychologist and even probably the statistician would say. Well, look, the fact that humans see faces and everything really highlights the point that we're trying to make, that this is all being read from the individual psyche. Now, mathematics, most likely aligning with the probability theorists, but Jung had a really interesting idea regarding mathematics, and that was that numbers are the archetype of order. Numbers are the archetype of order, and they participate in synchronicities, and they contribute to what he called the chaotic phenomenon in nonlinear dynamics. And so this isn't by no means a dogma amongst mathematicians. This isn't a typical opinion or perspective, but I just wanted to include that because the numbers being archetypes of order would align to the way that I do apologetics. Somebody like Jay Dyer does apologetics with logos theology, the rooting of number theory, logic, the laws of logic, all this stuff being rooted within the logos. And then the fact that he's talking about numbers as being the archetype of order, which to a degree we could get in line with. Depends on how he's understanding the archetype of order, right? Because of course order comes from logos from our perspective, but that his framing of that could easily be placed within a logos theological interpretation and be totally consistent. My opinion. And then the last sort of academic attribute or dimension of the synchronicity that I wanted to mention was quantum physics. Now, quantum physics hasn't done much since the 80s, really. And that's where quantum entanglement and a lot of these, the double slit experiment, a lot of this stuff occurred and gave rise to a lot of these quantum mechanical ideas like quantum entanglement, which is then the theory that Jung was picking up and trying to incorporate in his idea of synchronicity. Of course, the presupposition of the quantum entanglement is that the world is all particles, and they have experimentation to try to highlight quantum entanglement amongst particles at non-locally at dramatic distances and stuff like this. Interesting, very interesting. I think that the kind of scientific, the particle, the worldview, this is inadequate in my opinion. But but one of the things that was being discussed was David Bohm's implicate order. In the implicate order, he describes as there being the explicate order or the unfolded order, the implicate infolded order, and then you have the source or ground of both. And this is him using quantum mechanics, quantum physics in the 1980s to reinterpret the nature of reality. Now, one of the things that I wrote after looking into explicit order, implicate order, source and ground of being, that it starts to sound like a sort of Hegelian dialectic. And what I mean by that is thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Not that it matches on perfectly to David Bohm's idea, but the idea of the implicate, the explicate and the implicate, and then having their source in the source or ground of being, it still doesn't account for being itself. And all, right? If you're going to do apologetic, there's a lot of holes here in the worldview, but I just wanted to bring this up because this is often referred to in regards to synchronicity and this idea within a sort of academic context. Now, moving to the New Age, how does New Age frame synchronicity? How do the New Agers, the spiritual but not religious, or the psychedelics, or the Wicca, or whatever whatever you're into, how do they understand synchronicity? Well, I would say here is the beginning towards divine providence. So, of course, we would critique this worldview, the New Age, religious, the perennialistic, the all religions meet at the same mountaintop. We would debunk all that as being illogical. But the way that I'm going to start to describe the New Age understandings of synchronicity is certainly moving towards where we're going to go with a larger conception of powerful, omnipotent deity that is outside creation, right? This is our energy essence distinction. This is our Trinitarian understanding within the Orthodox Christian concept. And yeah, so anyways, okay. So New Age, they say that God, basically, this is a general trend. I'm just making generalities here. Of course, there's exceptions. That God is basically equal to the universe or the cosmos. And in previous videos, we've discussed, how various spiritual people will talk about the universe or the cosmos or creation itself as if it is God. And this is kind of the subtle, pantheistic kind of worldview underpinning what is now, kind of the New Age religion or spiritual but not religious or psychedelics, all of which for me are stemming out of the same place, the same kind of world of ideas, the same sources of conceptions and ideas about the world. A lot of this stuff is moving from, and a lot of it, this is kind of digressing from the point of this video, a lot of those ideas are in opposition to the things that we're trying to put out in this channel, or in opposition to Christianity, really. The whole feminization, feminism, the worship of nature, a movement back to pantheism, emotionalism as opposed to more logical understandings. All this stuff for me is a sort of dialectical tension with Christianity itself, but that will be addressed in another video. So God equals universe and cosmos, and that everything is consciousness and matter are linked. So consciousness and matter are linked. Now they're dipping their toes into the quantum mechanical realm. This is certainly where Jung was moving towards, in the 20th century, is that, consciousness, the psyche, the unconscious, archetypes, these things are linked. Matter and mind is linked. And we even saw the author in this one saying that mind and matter are linked, or consciousness and matter. I would say the New Agers they have totally bought onto that presupposition, and they are moving forward on it. Now, they use things like Ilya Prigogine. He was a Russian chemist, and he is responsible for kind of discovering or working on sort of spontaneous formation of coherent structures. And this is used as a sort of chemical, biological example of potential synchronicity, out of this sort of chaotic petri dish, if you will. They can form spontaneous formation of chemical structures. And so there's a sort of affinity, a sort of a pattern, and so a lot of New Age. I'm getting these ideas from going through New Age websites and looking up how they're describing synchronicity, and so they're referring to this particular individual who may or may not even subscribe to a synchronistic understanding of the world or meaningful connections. I'm not even sure. I didn't look into his spiritual or religious disposition, but they use Ilya a lot, and they refer to his sort of spontaneous formation of coherent structures using chemical structures to highlight that this actually occurs in nature, that somehow these things move towards coherency. Now, from our worldview, logos is the formation of all order out of chaos. This is what God was doing in Genesis, and so the idea that structures would spontaneously form in the midst of chaos is not really surprising from a sort of Christian logos theological perspective. But the New Agers will use this to say, oh no, synchronicity is absolutely real. Look at this scientific experiment on chemical structure. Same thing with the Japanese guy that did water molecules and wrote love and hate and all this stuff on the petri dishes, and then the crystalline structure of those molecules were different based on the words. Same water molecule, but it crystallized differently with the word love versus the word hate on it. Okay, I forget. It's like Dr. Moto something. I don't remember. But that's another kind of New Age scientific experiment that's referenced a lot. Another one is Dr. Carl Prebam, and he has the idea that the mind is a hologram, and that reality, what the world that we observe, is isomorphic to our minds. And so, the mind is a hologram of reality, and it's a play back and forth. Now, this is also used as a theory. Say, oh, well, look at this scientific theory. I think this guy's out of Stanford. Look at this theory and how this could be understood to be related to synchronicity. That, well, maybe the events that we're actually having are dependent on our mind and that they're actually connected. And so you can see where a lot of New Age understandings of the law of attraction, of positive thinking, visualization, all this stuff would start to be tied to this understanding of mind and matter being fused, mind or consciousness and matter being one and the same thing. And that is just another example that I wanted to highlight. Now, the panpsychic paradigm is replete within the New Age worldview. So I talked about pantheism. Well, I would argue that in relation to pantheism is a panpsychism. And this is actually even being argued amongst serious academics because of the inability to account for consciousness, that potentially everything's conscious. Potentially consciousness is what's holding molecular structures together. And so panpsychism, it has an immense pagan and Neoplatonic element. I was reading one thing from the Theosophical Society, and it was talking about the mind of God and how this is, anybody who doesn't believe that all things are connected and it all goes back to the one, how they're, sort of ignorant. And it was even using quotes from Plotinus. Plotinus goes back to sort of father of Neoplatonism. So very Neoplatonic pagan understandings of the kind of panpsychic paradigm that I'm seeing out of the New Age related to synchronicity. And so finally, this leads to synchronicity being in tune with the mind of God. This is how the Theosophical website was articulating it, that a synchronistic event that occurs in your life is really you being in tune with the mind of God. And I want to use that as the bridge point to now get into divine providence, God's will. Because from the Orthodox perspective, from the Logos theological understanding, to a degree, we can get on board with some of this stuff. We can get on board to the idea of divine mind, the mind of God. That's what the Logos is the mind of God. This is the Son. This is the second person of the Trinity. And it is through our nous in which we are able to participate with the divine mind of God. And the nous is the eyes of the heart. This is a common way in which we phrase this. A sort of mixture between the mind, but also heart. You combine these ideas, now you're closer to the conception of nous within the Eastern Orthodox understanding, and it is the nous in which we can actually participate in the Logos. So now we're moving over to God's providence, and we can see a serious connection. We can see how the New Agers are actually moving in this direction. Of course, they have a whole theological worldview that's going to fall apart. They worship nature. They worship idols. They can't account for the creation of anything. So their paradigm is really weak and fragile, but their yearning for this idea that synchronicities are actually divine occurrences, I think, is on point. And so that's what I want to say is that divine providence then, synchronicity is divine providence. A synchronistic occurrence is divine providence. And divine providence is not fate. This is not destiny. This is a common objection. You start to talk to somebody And they're saying, oh, you believe in divine providence? Yeah. So basically, you believe in fate and destiny. What's the difference between that and astrology? Well, quite a bit. First of all, divine providence is not fate, it is not destiny. The idea that God has a plan for every individual, this is tied to divine providence, that there is a sort of I think the theological term usually is vocation. There is a vocation, there is a purpose for every individual that God creates. And this is a providential purpose for your own life. And so when I think of God's providence, I think of synchronicity as a sort of minor pattern, a minor fractal, if you will. But God's providence is the entire fractal pattern of everything. It is, and so synchronicities, and so now I'm getting into stuff that I've even looked up on Orthodox websites, Christian Orthodox websites, how they're understanding God's providence in relation to coincidences in one's life, what we would call synchronistic events, things that seem absolutely random or spontaneous aren't at all, from the theological understanding, from a providential understanding that we need to align with God's will. And God's will is going to be occurring through these sort of synchronistic events. And so synchronicities, as will be mentioned, I actually have a thing here that I want to read related to, this is actually written by an Orthodox father, that synchronicities, these coincidences, these divine providential experiences are supposed to, they don't always, because we are allowed free will. This is the big key and why providence is not fate or destiny, is that there is a free will dimension to all this stuff, that you can choose whether you want to be a part of God's will or not. Of course, through providence itself, your choosing to not be a part of God's will then work out, that butterfly effect of events, whatever you choose, will eventually work out towards God's providence, because God has full dominion over history itself. But within history, we all have a free choice. We all have free will, and this is because we're made in the image of God, and that we need to, love is by choice. Love is, you can't love something, by definition, you can't love something if you're forced to love it. And so that's why we have free will, in order to recognize the creator of the universe through our own volition. That is authentic love. That is authentic pursuit of truth, justice, honor, God, however you want to describe that. And so that is why it's not fate. We are saying you still have free will, even though God, kind of from a teleological perspective, God may have a purpose for you. You don't have to choose that. You can choose to do something else. And in fact, you might be somewhat happy doing something else, but to be fully happy, to be fully in God's will for your life, your skill set, your abilities are going to be pushing you towards a particular direction that is God's will for you. And so I wanted to read just real quickly, what does it mean to devote yourself to following divine providence? And this is tied to why I wanted to make this the last video of 2019, because 2020, this is exactly what I want to do with my life. Is I want to be a better person. I want to make sure almost everything I'm doing is in relation to God's will, not my will. I don't, there's, the last decade, there were instances of sigil magic on my part, doing things that I absolutely regret now. Not that anything's having a continuous effect on me or anything like that. My point being is just my understanding of the world. Magic itself is tied to man, woman, humanity pursuing their own will, so the reason magic works is because we have free will. Magic, from the Christian perspective, is absolutely real. Magic exists because we occupy a unique position within the hierarchy of beings. So demons and angels don't have free will. They are kind of locked into the good or evil side of the spiritual war that they're in, whereas humanity can elevate itself along this kind of hierarchy of beings. We have free will. We can prove ourselves. We can become demons. We can fall. We can choose our will over God's will. These are all things that we can do. This is why humanity, from the magical, esoteric, spiritual, occult perspective, can conjure entities to do the bidding for their will. Of course, there's a bartering there. They have to get things in exchange. This is with the whole myth of selling your soul to the devil and all this stuff. But all that occurs is because of the presupposition that we have free will. And Christianity recognizes this, and that then the practicing of magic is you pursuing your will. And my whole discussion here on God's providence and in the whole metaphysical structure of synchronicities is about God's will and you following God's will. And I think that synchronicities have worked in the past decade was full of synchronicities that certainly I was in the wrong place. I wasn't thinking about God's will. I wasn't thinking about a larger metaphysical Christian understanding of history or the world or these synchronistic events or God's providence. But through the following of those synchronistic events in a very honest and integral way, it led me to Orthodox Christianity. It led me to a very different world than the one that I thought I was pursuing, even though I was moving through these sort of synchronistic portals, in terms of what I thought they were meaning in terms of a larger perspective. So, okay, enough of me rambling. I want to read these few paragraphs from, or let me tell you the author. It's Father David Moser. He is at an American. This is in Boise, Idaho. He's the father of an American parish of the Russian Orthodox Church, St. Seraphim of Sarov Orthodox Church in Boise, Idaho. And he wrote this, and I thought it was very wise, and I just wanted to share with you guys. So he writes, so, quote, abandonment to divine providence, unquote, is not about fate, but rather about seeking and finding the salvific and grace-bearing elements in the events of our lives and pursuing those rather than getting lost in the cares of the world. We should arrange our lives according to the will of God in order that we can operate with the divine providence and benefit from all that God sends to us. Often, we waste our time worrying about discerning the will of God and trying to figure out what God's grand plan for our life is. This is foolish. The will of God for us is, of course, that we should be saved and enter into a union and communion with Him. When we look at doing the will of God, St. Theophan instructs us to do the obvious, to do just those things which are at hand. Quote, as to what God wants, we certainly know that from the commandments He has given us. Is someone seeking help? Help him. Has someone offended you? Forgive him. Have you offended somebody? Rush to ask for forgiveness and make peace. Did somebody praise you? Don't be proud. Did somebody scold you? Don't be angry. Is it time to pray? Pray. Is it time to work? Work. In other words, the will of God isn't some great mystery that we have to figure out. It is God's will for each of us to be saved, and this life is only for preparation of that. All we have to do in this life is to respond to each moment and each event in the way that will produce in us a spiritual growth and spiritual fruit. How do we know what that is? We know from the teaching of the gospel, the life of the church, and the life of the lives of the saints. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says that we should not worry about tomorrow, or rather that we concern ourselves only with today. That includes following God's will. Just take care of the people and events God gives you today, here and now. Don't be concerned with where you should be tomorrow. God will take care of that. What we will come to in the end is that it is one thing to talk about doing the will of God, but finally we must just do it. Think of a car. When you try to turn the wheels of a car while it's standing still, it is difficult. There's a lot of resistance in the tires to changing direction. You really have to pull hard on the wheel. But if the car is moving, even if only a little, the resistance seems to disappear and the car can be turned easily with little effort. When you are standing still, it is difficult for God to point you in the right direction. But if you are moving ahead, taking each step as it comes, doing the best as you know how to do, then it is much easier for God to direct you and steer your life in the direction that will lead you to the kingdom of heaven. To follow the will of God, to keep going ahead, taking the next step. If God wants to move you in a different direction, He can and will do it. All you have to do is to approach everything with faith and prayer and let God sort out the rest. In the next year, resolve simply to do the will of God. That is, to today, the things that are put in front of you by God. Don't worry about next year or next month or tomorrow or even 5 minutes from now. Do the thing God has put before you today, right here and right now. If you try to figure out God's grand plan and the misdirections of the evil one, then you will get distracted from following the will of God here and now. Simply do what God gives you each day, and He will bring you to Himself. And so I read that. It may be redundant for some of you guys, so I apologize. But the idea, you could take, there's a synonymous aspect here that I'm applying to synchronicity and God's providence in doing the here and now, and how I see synchronicity, like I mentioned before, as a sort of a pattern, a sort of a micro pattern, right, of the meaningful coincidences that occur in a synchronistic event. But then, okay, so let me explain it this way. God's providence is a sort of following God's will lead to more and more synchronistic events that will be organized in the correct pattern. So, someone who is working in an area in which they are not pursuing the highest interests of God's will start to create patterns in their lives that I would argue aren't ideal. So maybe they're alcoholics, maybe they have toxic relationships with their wife or their girlfriend, or they're liars, or all this stuff. And so those ripple effects occur. Whereas if you're pursuing God's will, for example, if you want to find your wife, going to the bar, going to clubs may not, they're most likely not going to get you there, especially if you're trying to move from God's providence, God's will. But what will get you there is doing the thing that you're called to do, living your life in a moral, in the least sinful way as possible, moving in that direction, doing what you know to be right, and by that ripple effect, synchronicities will begin to occur. Well, you'll meet the right woman who has the same intention as you, because that intention brought you guys in a synchronistic fashion to the same place at the same time for the same purpose. And so when I look at it, following God's will is going to allow God's hand, if you will, to be in all the different aspects of your life, and that the incongruencies, the inconsistencies within our lives are really due to moving away from those patterns, and moving away from divine order, moving away from logos, and moving away from God. And so that's why then providence and synchronicity for me is such a synonymous idea. I mean, these synchronistic events really aren't baffling when you think of history, when you think of your life, when you think of everything as having a teleological purpose. And therefore, people meeting at a certain event at a certain time for a certain purpose, that only makes sense. It only makes sense. In my mind, again, it's patterns. It's patterns, if you want to put it this way, the logos is all fractals, right? And then a synchronistic event is certainly just almost like one spiral of the fractal. It's just one dimension of the pattern. And from, I think, a Christian worldview, we can take that and we can read synchronistic events a little bit better than maybe the New Age people who are bound up in a whole illogical worldview in which then they're reading these meaningful coincidences, which I still believe to be God's providence. Even if you're a Satanist, even if whoever you are, synchronistic events, God's providence is still working in their lives. And from the Orthodox perspective, if they're not living a moral life, they're nous. They're kind of the union between their mind and their heart, won't even be able to recognize the meaning, won't even be able to recognize the providential occurrence that is happening, or the synchronicity that occurred. So that's really what I wanted to talk about in terms of moving into 2020, because for me, 2020, I want to devote my life to God's will. I see the last decade. I see patterns that I've had that I'm trying to end. I see, I just see that I want to make 2020s obviously the most incredible decade of my life thus far, as I'm sure most of you guys do, but doing it not based on some hedonistic pursuit of how I'm going to make all this money or I'm going to do this. It's really, I want to pray more. I want to make sure what I'm doing is in line with God's will. I want to find the right person. I just want to do things right, so then the patterns that occur, the people that I meet, the circumstances I find myself are then reflective of me pursuing God's will. And so that's what I want to do for 2020. That is one of the things that was on my mind and sort of reflecting on the past year, 2019, but then the past decade. And that's what I really want to talk to you guys about. So, let me know what you guys think. Like I was mentioning, Providence and synchronicity is the organizing principle of our lives. I believe that to be true. That these synchronicities are more like signposts that are really allowing us to be conscious of if we're on the right path or not. And like I said, if you're following the right path, if you're following God's will, I think that marriage, if you're looking for a wife, well, then don't necessarily, and this would be tough for me, and I'm sure tough from you guys who are looking for your life partner and all the complexities and questions that come with that. But instead of focusing on finding that person, focus on fulfilling God's will, and with the intention that doing this, you'll eventually find the right person. And I think you actually will find the right person. Now, I could be overly romantic in this, and I'm sure some people would criticize me for that. But I feel if you're doing the thing, God's providential purpose for you, that pattern, that ripple effect, that butterfly effect is only going to lead to you finding the person who, I don't want to say soulmate or anything like that. I don't, that seems like an illogical worldview or anything like that. But it will lead you to coming to an encounter with the ideal mate, with the ideal person that fits the pattern of God's will. And I think this is true with career and vocation. As I said, we all have a vocation, we all have a purpose, we all have a career. And maybe you like the job that you have because you make good money, but it's not really what I like to do. It's not really my vocation. It's not really what my gift is. Well, the only way to get happier is to start doing the thing that you're given, what your gift is. And then by doing that, again, ripple effects, new patterns, you're now following God's will. And if that affects your marriage or your dating or whoever, it's all going to come together by you doing what God's will is, what the purpose for your life is. And that's what I want to focus on 2020. That's what I'm trying to focus on myself is maneuvering the kind of difficulties, the obstacles between what I want and my current circumstances, and then trying to figure out what God's will is for me. And even in the example of if somebody's, in need around you, to help them, the kind of immediate, this was what our Orthodox father was mentioning in regards to God's providence. If somebody's in your vicinity, in the here and now, focus on God's will in the here and now and doing what God wants. Then, and you can see, again, this is all based on this idea of the ripple effects. And then think about when you're helping somebody else, how that is a sort of synchronicity, right? Imagine somebody's sick and everybody's walking them by and they have a name in their head, and then you see this as somebody trying to align themselves with God's will, and then you walk up to them and start to help them, and your name is this name in their mind, and now they're having this incredible synchronistic event where, oh my God, what are the chances, you have the same name that I was thinking, and now you're here. So that's what I meant by patterns, fractals, God's will, God's providence, synchronicity. To me, these are all connected. Along with the integrity in relationships. I think our relationships are patternistic based on our own integrity, how honest we are with people, how straightforward, when it's necessary to be straightforward, right? Obviously, there's circumstances where you don't want to be, but those kind of Christian values implemented in regards to our relationships are essential in then creating ideal relationships. Relationships, I don't want to say based on, but colored by the will of God, God's providence. So that's really all I have for you guys. I know this has been kind of a all over the place video, but it was just something I'd been thinking about and I wanted to make. I was like, oh, well, this would be an interesting topic for the last video I make for 2019, is kind of bearing my heart in regards to what I want to do and really devote my life to a providential God's will for my own life, how I'm maneuvering, how I'm working in the world, the things that I'm pursuing, the patterns that I'm creating, the ripple effects that are, rippling. But let me know what you guys think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you see synchronicity in maybe a different fashion? Do you think that there's, because for me, God's providence is such a larger idea than synchronicity, and synchronicity is a big idea for, I think, spiritual people, but to me it fits so easily within a larger understanding of God's providence and Logos theology. So to me, you really can't have the one without the other. I don't see another worldview in which you can understand synchronicities in such a complete and holistic way as you can within a Christian Logos theologically centered worldview. So that's why I put this video together. I know I'm all over the place, but let me know what you guys think. Please like, share, and subscribe to the video. Please, leave comments in the comment section if you think I'm way off, if you think I'm close, if you think I'm moving towards something. I would appreciate getting your guys' feedback. So, as always, thank you for all the love and support. I truly, truly appreciate it. And until next time, until 2020, and I see you guys again, as always, God bless.